Ever since the sudden death of Justice Antonin Scalia, there's been a tug-of-war here in Washington to determine the future of the Supreme Court. President Obama has already appointed 2 justices to the highest court who have opposed our constitutional right to own firearms for self-defense. So can we really expect anything different with this third choice, Judge Merrick Garland? Garland's record as a federal appeals court judge shows he is not a supporter of the Second Amendment. As former Attorney General Edwin Meese told me, we are facing, quote, a constitutional crisis. And he agrees that the American people, not Obama, should play a role in filling the vacancy left by Justice Scalia. Take a look.
Today I am nominating Chief Judge Merrick Brian Garland to join the Supreme Court.
Probably no president in modern history has trashed the Constitution by executive actions as this president. And so to allow Obama in his last year in office to put another judge on the court, in other words, to pack the court with people who don't believe in the Constitution and who would not follow the Constitution, I think would be wrong for the Constitution and wrong for the country. Both of his previous nominees swore to uphold the Constitution and said they would when they were confirmed. They did that before the Senate committee.
The task of a judge is not to make law. It is to apply the law. Fidelity to the law.
The Supreme Court, of course, has the responsibility of ensuring that our government never oversteps its proper bounds or violates the rights of individuals that have defined this nation since its founding.
And I think that's what judges are supposed to do. Make sure that they're faithful to the Constitution, faithful to the law, and not on some extraneous factor like politics.
And yet, as soon as they took the bench, they fell right into this block of justices who vote against the Constitution. So I think any nominee of this president, they would probably fall right into the same type of violations of the Constitution. Particularly decisions on matters like the Second Amendment, the ability of people to own and bear arms. This is typical, I think, of a mindset that Obama's nominees have, including the current nominee, and that is that the Constitution ought to mean what the judges say it is rather than what the Constitution actually says.
So what I hear you saying is that an Obama nominee is no Justice Scalia.
That is correct. And I don't think Obama would ever nominate someone who really followed the Constitution as Justice Scalia did. Justice Scalia was probably, of all the justices in history, one of the most faithful supporters of the Constitution as it was actually written.
You don't sit here to make the law. Its proper role is in a democracy to give a fair and honest interpretation to the meaning of either Congress in statutes or the people when they ratify the Constitution. Simple as that.
He's one of a kind, such a great example of the kind of justices that President Reagan wanted to put in place. And of course, I was privileged to participate in advising President Reagan when he made that appointment of Justice Scalia to the court.
He really is a rare breed. When it came to the Second Amendment, there were no questions. He supported it, he was a hunter, and he believed in the right.
Well, he believed in the right, but it wasn't just because that was his personal preference. He believed in it because that's what the Constitution said. And so this particular appointment means that it could turn a majority of the court over to people who don't believe in a fundamental and faithful interpretation of the Constitution.
So are we talking about cases like Heller, McDonald, Citizens United, those cases being overturned?
It's entirely possible that that could take place. The next nominee will be a decider, if you will, and that, of course, could mean a major change in the laws of the land.
And the danger in that, we're talking about years of having an impact.
Absolutely. This nation has gone through a period of the last 50 years, unlike the earlier days in the Constitution, where some justices have tried to go beyond what the Constitution says, or in many cases are opposed to what the Constitution actually says. Those are the kinds of things that divide a country. That's what really is involved with this nomination.
I have fulfilled my constitutional duty. Now it's time for the Senate to do theirs. I simply ask Republicans in the Senate to give him a fair hearing, and then an up or down vote.
No, he will not be considered by the Senate.
So is the Senate required to hold a hearing on a Supreme Court nominee?
No. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires them to hold a hearing. All it requires is that they determine whether or not they will give their advice and consent on a particular nominee. And that's in essence what the Senate is doing.
The Senate will continue to observe the Biden rule, underlining that what we're talking about is a principle and not a person.
Once the political season is underway, and it is, action on a Supreme Court nomination must be put off until after the November election is completed.
So what's changed?
The only thing that's changed is who the president is. They said that when it was George W. Bush who was president.
Your group put out a memo supporting the Senate.
The Conservative Action Project felt it was important to put this out so that the public would understand, to allow this idea of anti-constitutionalism to be perpetuated for a quarter of a century or more to come with the confirmation of a nominee made by this president. It's a threat to carrying out the vision of the founders.
Of the many powers and responsibilities that the Constitution vests in the presidency, few are more consequential than appointing a Supreme Court justice, particularly one to succeed Justice Scalia.
Certainly the most long-standing action that a president takes, for the most part, is who he or she appoints to have a lifetime term on the Supreme Court of the United States. And in the case of the past experience with this president, it has not been good, and therefore I think the Senate is very properly saying, let's let the people decide who the next president will be, and that's plenty of time then to put someone on the court.
Of course, the American people should have a say in the court's direction. So let's give them a voice in this momentous decision.
I think that the election of 2016 is probably one of the most important elections, certainly in my lifetime. It was very important for Ronald Reagan to be elected to change the disastrous course that we were on in 1980. But it is perhaps even more serious now in terms of the interpretation of the Constitution because of the divided court that we're facing at the present time.
If Hillary Clinton becomes president, what would life look like in this country?
If Hillary Clinton was elected, we would simply be having Obama's third term, because she has been lockstep with him in terms of our national security, in terms of our economy, in terms of the rights of citizens being protected, and I think it would be a real tragedy for this nation if that happened.
What do you say to those people who say, you know what, I'm thinking about sitting out this election?
When we have a constitutional crisis, I think anyone who sits out the election really is failing in their duty as a citizen to vote for a president who will preserve the constitutional republic that the founders gave us and protect the Constitution, which has made America different from any other country in the world.